Cool. Thank you all for coming along tonight. I always like to begin conversations by asking why Nitro, why it rather than 1,000 other ideas. Sort of, as you were thinking about starting the company, what was the sort of trigger or catalyst for the idea?
Yeah, sure. When we started the business back in 2005, the idea actually began forming probably 6 months prior. And we were looking for a really big problem. We were looking for something that we would call a universal pain point. And we narrowed it down to what we then started calling universal document pain points. And we were really aiming for a market that was truly global, truly universal, and one that had significant scale. So we were a bunch of software guys, and we actually had an email marketing business at the time, and we kind of switched focus to the document space. And the idea was really born of a bunch of research that we did that indicated that even in 2004, and sadly things haven't changed a lot today, the majority of businesses work very inefficiently with documents throughout the organization. So it doesn't matter like which functional area you look at, if it's HR, if it's sales, if it's finance, if it's legal, there's still a lot of paper being pushed around, and where it's digital, it's still pretty inefficient. So we set out to solve, big, universal document pain points that knowledge workers encounter every day.
And describe the email marketing business, and you'd founded that, and what size was the company, and most importantly, how did you know that wasn't the business? How did you know to do something else that wasn't email marketing?
Well, funnily enough, I wasn't in love with email marketing because I don't think I was ever comfortable with the idea of running a company that could be spamming millions of people. The company was in its very early stages, so we had a team of about half a dozen working on the idea. We had some amount of product market fit. We were basically trying to build an email marketing solution that was much more attractive to the decision maker for email marketing solutions at the time, and still today, which is kind of a head of marketing. And most heads of marketing back then would say that their email marketing solutions didn't provide enough graphical reporting to justify to CEOs why they should keep investing in marketing budgets and increasing those investments. So we really came at kind of the email marketing opportunity with this idea of giving marketing directors a much better solution. I think what was tough for us at the time, I think the reason that we shied away from it and went towards the Nitro opportunity in the end was that at the time, there wasn't this kind of ecosystem that exists on the web today for content and information, customer information, and so on. And so we actually had to build two things at the time. This is sort of the pre-Salesforce era. We had to build two things: a content platform for hosting all the content to basically track all the things that we were tracking in this email marketing solution, as well as the kind of front-end reporting solution, that the idea was kind of based around. So it was a huge undertaking for a very small team. I think it was probably too big a project for our experience and ability at the time.
And then once you had the idea for Nitro, what small feature set did you decide upon for the first version, and describe how you sold the first customer or the first handful of customers?
So we, with Nitro, we basically spent 6 months trying to get a product into market. We licensed a bunch of technology. We saw that there was a window. Nitro Pro, by the way, guys, was the first replacement for Adobe Acrobat. Today it's the leading replacement for Acrobat. And we wanted to be the first, and so we basically licensed a bunch of technology. We wrote a bunch of code. We basically created what you'd call a minimum viable product in terms of it being an alternative or a replacement, a true replacement for Acrobat, and got it out there. And it wasn't, frankly, version 1 wasn't a very good product, but we knew we had something because we went live at like noon in May of 2005, and within 45 minutes we'd had our first sale. So we'd done a bunch of content advertising to generate that first sale. That was really how the business got its start.
Who was the first customer? How much did they pay?
I can't recall. Actually, I can recall. It was a business in Texas, and they would have paid like $99.
Right. And describe the problem with Acrobat at the time, and maybe also now, but at the time, what were the frustrations for what kind of people, and what were they creating with PDF documents that Acrobat was sort of inhibiting, or the price, or
so
what was the frustration?
I think we were actually trying to solve a problem that not a lot of organizations knew they had, which I think is actually a challenge for a lot of startups. Like I think startups need to define a problem and then propose a solution, and often they do one and not the other. Typically the solution bit rather than the problem definition bit. We didn't necessarily hear from organizations that they knew that they had a document productivity problem. However, it was really obvious to us that they did. And fundamentally the reason that most of these organizations weren't working efficiently with documents was because the only solution on the market was Acrobat, and it was prohibitively expensive. And so it was never ubiquitously deployed. And so the power in document productivity, if you want to save your employees hours and hours a week from pushing paper and doing things really inefficiently, you need tools and capabilities on basically every desktop. And so we went into the market basically thinking there were two really great price points. One price point was going to be lower than whatever Adobe was charging for Acrobat, and the other price point was free. And so today, as Cheryl mentioned earlier, we have over 8 million people a month using Nitro products. The very vast majority of those, of course, are not paying. And so offering something for free has absolutely enabled us to get the ubiquitous deployment, which is really necessary to get document productivity happening in any kind of organization.
And you described that the email marketing business had 6 people originally. How did those 6 people come together? What were the different roles? And did Nitro provide a sort of a fork in the road for some of them to leave the business? Or how did the team come together, and how did you define the roles? Yeah,
they all came across. So Nitro actually was founded with sort of 2 companies coming together, Aliqua, which was the email marketing business, and another little business that was sharing office space with us. And so it was basically 2 teams of about half a dozen each, and we all just got along fabulously. And so it was kind of one of those classic meeting of the mind experiences. And then we tried to divvy up responsibilities, which frankly was pretty challenging. Not so much maybe in the early days, because you're filled with energy and excitement, everything's great, and then you hit bumps, and some of the ruptures start to happen with the friendships and everything else. So we had a pretty tough time maybe in the first 2 or 3 years, but the team was really organised around kind of product, sales, marketing. What I was really bringing to the table, my team from Aliqua was bringing sales and marketing and sort of general management experience, and then the other guys were bringing product and engineering.
And those first 2 years, what goals did you have in mind for the business? 12 mouths to feed. Did you have to do consulting in the early days, or did you raise some round of capital, or the previous businesses were able to fund? How did you get started?
Yes, that's a good question. So, like a lot of Australian startups, we were absolutely doing services in the early days. And I learned to hate services by doing services. With no offence to Hall Chadwick. The problem with scaled services are great, but little service businesses are pretty terrible. I remember being 19 and we had about 60,000 a month. 30,000 a month in payroll to make and other expenses, rent and so on. And every couple of months, I'd have this up to sort of $60,000, bill building up, and be chasing clients to pay me to get the thing paid. And I didn't sleep at all for years. And so when we actually started the email marketing, business, what we were doing up to that point was email marketing services. So we'd kind of identified a need that we actually had. There wasn't an ESP or email, solution on the market that was serving our needs. So we decided to build it. But we continued with that services business for probably quite a lot of the first 2 years, just to keep the lights on. And
that is an incredibly common way to build a startup in Australia. How do you divide? Is it X number of people with 100% of their focus on consulting that's paying the salaries of the other people that are completely focused on building product? And how did you manage the balance of that?
Yeah, it'd be nice to say that it was clean and clear cut. we tried to make it clean and clear cut, but it never really was. I think, doing things, with the benefit of hindsight, it was probably the right model for the time because we had no other options. This was Australia in kind of the early 2000s, and the venture, ecosystem wasn't particularly sophisticated. So we really had no choice. Today, I wouldn't choose to do it that way. I think kind of the purity of the idea is the most important thing today. And if you've got distractions, you just, decrease your shot at success.
And then the first 2 years of the business, what were sort of your, ambition changes over time? Your ambition now is likely incredibly different than what your ambitions were at the start. What was your initial definition of success for Nitro, and how did reality sort of play out after your initial goal?
Yeah, I think our initial hope was that we'd build a business that would basically pay for a bunch of mates to fly around the world and have a good time. And that's probably, we didn't have investors for the first couple of years, so that's pretty much what we did. We had a very good time. I think we were always ambitious though. We definitely had designs on building something pretty significant. And, I remember saying to our first seed investor, this is going to be a $100 million value business, in a few years' time. And sure enough, we hit that value threshold a while back. And, what was interesting was we actually had, confidentially, even though this is a room full of people and this is being recorded, we've had lots of acquisition offers, over time. We've turned them down because we want to keep building. And so, even though that kind of first goal of getting to a certain value was kind of the thing that we raised money on in the first instance, you fast forward to today and we're looking at something much bigger than that. So I think, we're still on the journey. Our mission, that we set out on isn't complete. And so the way we're sort of describing where Nitro is, right now is that we're in year 1 of chapter 2. Our first chapter's been about Nitro Pro on the desktop, and we have just over 500,000 customers, so 500,000 businesses running Nitro Pro today. It's a really good little business. And year 1 of chapter 2 is all about this next chapter in the cloud and Nitro Cloud. So we released a product last year called Nitro Cloud, and it's basically web-based, document sharing, workflow, and e-signing. And so we think there's a big opportunity to kind of take all the concepts that we were trying to solve for with Nitro Pro on the desktop and solve for them in the cloud and on mobile. And so it's actually a whole new era for us. We've sort of set another new mission. We're actually kind of turning the business around to really focus all of our energies on chapter 2.
In the initial years, when did you know that it would be something? So you knew that you got to an initial level of success, that it would at least be able to provide a small business. What were sort of those metrics that or those moments where you knew that it would be something rather than nothing? I knew it was something pretty much from the outset. I think we had revenues from day one. So we had the services revenue, but we whittled that off over the course of 1 or 2 years. So I think we knew we had a business, but I really wouldn't say we got comfortable with kind of looking at our success until maybe the last 6 months, which may sound a bit strange because we're 10 years old in May. But I think for us last year, we really defined our second chapter, even if we hadn't really started executing on it. We did release Nitro Cloud, but we hadn't really started to ramp it up. We raised money from a US firm, a tier 1 firm, Blackbird Ventures, in Q4. It was the first time ever. We've actually had a bunch of money on the balance sheet. We've pretty much run the thing on the P&L from day one. So I think probably the first time that we actually went, we've got something here, was really last year when offers started coming for the business and when we decided to raise money and could raise money from a really credible firm. Sure. Talk about the decision to initially raise a seed round. When did that come about? How was that experience? And compared to, say, funding environments now versus back then, what was different, and what lessons can you share from that early fundraising experience?
Well, there are no wonderful micro VCs around like Blackbird Ventures. There weren't in those days. So we didn't really have a seed stage funding environment in Australia that went beyond a few angels. So actually it was Andy Barlow from Hitwise, one of the founders of Hitwise, who wrote us our first check, really believed in us. And I think we were talking just before, Niki and I, about how a lot of the VCs in Australia have missed a lot of the current crop of success stories. I think when we raised money back in 2006, I think it was, late 2006, from Andy Barlow and a couple of other successful entrepreneurs, I don't think we would have been able to raise money from VCs at the time. We could kind of looked at the market, didn't really think the VCs were very good, to be brutally honest, and weren't sure we'd even get support, and so ended up raising from former entrepreneurs. And I think there are a bunch of VCs that missed out on businesses like Nitro in that era. Our decision to raise money was really driven by the desire to scale the business beyond what we could do with the cash flow that we had. We raised a seed round of $1 million and very promptly spent it. Had the worst product release in Nitro's history. Revenue went south by about 30%, literally month on month. And so we actually raised money. We closed the round in January 2007, and then we were down to probably 6 or 8 weeks worth of cash in August of that year. So it was a pretty swift fall. I think we got a little bit ahead of ourselves.
For people who will raise a seed round in this room, what will they waste the money on?
Everything. I think, look, we've raised money a few times now. We've raised money seed, we've raised money from Starfish Ventures here in Australia. Not a lot, $6.5 million from Starfish. Then we raised $15 million from Battery, in Q4. I think every time you raise money, you spend it pretty quickly. Like usually you've already built up, some accounts payable line, in the anticipation of raising money. You've probably been hiring people on the basis that you think you're going to raise money. So I tend to find that every time you do a round, like 20% washes out straight off the top. So that's probably where some of it will go. Whoever, you haven't paid, the creditors that have been hounding you for the last couple of months, they'll probably take 20%. And then I think where you'll probably waste the most money is hiring people you haven't hired before in roles you have no idea how to qualify. We've been learning this the whole way through. We're about 200 people now, and we still screw it up, but mainly with new roles that we haven't hired before. So if you've never hired an engineer if you're hiring an engineer rather for the first time, there's a high probability you'll screw that up. Same with the sales team. You're trying to find leaders for these things. You're trying to assess whether the leader for the team should be a startup person, somebody from a mid-staged, business, a bigger business. Never hire the people from bigger businesses ever, ever. I think it's the hiring that you screw up, and that's really where most of the cost goes. Try and keep it really lean. I think the hard thing is that for early stage startups today is that you've got a lot of mid-stage startups that are offering very compelling work environments. Like we spend at Nitro, I think probably $20,000, per employee per year over and above their salary, and any bonus in our San Francisco office just for the Nitro Dog and Pony show. So it's the free booze and the food, the catered lunches, all that stuff. It costs a lot. So I think the early stage guys, particularly in San Francisco, and I'm not sure if it's sort of true here as well, it's hard to convince people to come and work, basically in an environment where you have nothing, where it's just a few chairs and a few desks in a room. It doesn't look very glamorous. It's certainly not glamorous. And it's hard to win that talent when they're being offered, money by a bigger company that at least superficially looks like it's got its shit together. And it's tempting to spend money to try and compete, with the bigger guys in that regard, but you just can't. You've just got to hire the people that want to be, 5 people in a room who are happy to work on folding tables and don't give a crap about shitty laptops and really, working their asses off for a significant period of time, probably years, before it becomes anything of significance.
Go deeper keep unpacking the hiring mistakes. So the big company people that don't work in small companies, don't work out in small companies, the people who's you're paying too much for, but they're probably taking a pay cut and it's not working for both sides. Keep going along with the hiring mistakes that you can generalize out of all of the mistakes you make.
Yeah, I think one of the things I would encourage every startup to do is to really codify their values and the kinds of people they want to hire early on. We didn't really do this. We've subsequently become quite known for our culture and our values, and we kind of coined the term employee experience, or EX, to replace HR. And we're pretty focused on having an amazing culture, making Nitro a truly amazing place to work. But and people think we were like this from day one. We actually weren't. In the early days, we really just hired people who could get shit done. We didn't care about anything else. We wanted you to run through walls for us, for weeks or years. And that was kind of the early core team. It was just a bunch of very like-minded people, who wanted to achieve something big. But then as we scaled, we realized that the culture that we had for us didn't fit for other people. It was too aggressive, to be perfectly honest. It was a bit too hard charging to be appealing to all the different kinds of functional areas that you might have to hire for. And so at a certain point, probably, I'd say, like formally, it probably wasn't until we got maybe 5 years in, we really started to codify our value system. So today we have like 3 overarching values: high performance, no bullshit, and be good. Sort of 3 soundbitey things that everyone can remember. So if you can walk up to any Nitronaut and they'll be able to tell you what the headline three values are. And then we have what we call the Nitro Way, which is like this list of 15 things, actually it's 16 now, that we will or won't do. So it sort of says like, we will not do anything that damages our team or our company. We have one that says no fuckwits, which always gets a laugh. But I think it's important to have that stuff codified, because that actually really, it doesn't say anything about skill sets when you're hiring, but it or the way that people will perform necessarily inside the company from a pure performance point of view, but it does calibrate expectations in terms of how you expect people to behave. And I think that holds the team together, because when performance is up or performance is down, if people are behaving consistently in a high performance, no bullshit, be good kind of way, then you'll be okay. So I think getting kind of the values piece right is critical. And then when you're hiring, I guess my advice would be, and I didn't necessarily do enough of this, in the early days, if you're hiring for a role that you haven't hired for before, go and find a bunch of people who are great at that role. Now the ecosystem, for startups in Australia and everywhere, it's so rich that you can easily go and ask a bunch of people and find, the best 2 or 3 VPs of sales, in Sydney. And if you're going to hire a sales leader, go and ask those people, what does a great VP of sales look like? What's the background? What do they own? How do I comp the role? Like, try and sort of get a really good sense for what a great VP of sales looks like. Same thing for a VP of Eng. I think probably the hardest roles to hire, probably VPs of sales, VPs of engineering. Marketing's tough just because it's hard to find good marketers who can do modern marketing, like demand generation, as well as the branding and comms piece. But I think hiring's really hard. It's, I still probably spend 25% of my time hiring. Myself and my COO still meet every single Nitronaut before they get signed on as a kind of final, check and balance, even at 200 people. So it's the most important thing for anyone who's running a business or starting one or thinking of starting one. It's the single most important and high value thing you can do. Be involved in hiring and be involved in promotion reviews as well.
Talk about your decision to move to the US. What your thoughts were before you moved in terms of the benefits and so on, and then the realities once you had moved to San Francisco, and talk about some of the pros and cons. And I also know that you have hired heavily in Ireland, and how you came to that part of the world, and what worked and what are the good and bad of Ireland as well?
Yeah, sure. So when we moved to the States, it was mainly because we couldn't find the sort of qualified talent that we needed in Melbourne. So we started in Melbourne, and by kind of, I guess, early to mid 2008, I was pretty convinced we couldn't get particularly kind of marketing and web dev people that we needed in that local market. And I always sort of thought that if you were going to build a big tech business, then you should do it, in the Bay Area. So I kind of went across solo in mid 2008 to kind of figure out the path forward. We opened the office in downtown San Francisco in January 2009. It's a completely different world in San Francisco today versus January 2009. Literally the median technology wage in San Francisco has doubled. From 90,000 in 2009 to $180,000 today. One of the reasons we went there was that talent actually back in 2009 and rent back in 2009 was pretty cheap. It's literally grown at 15% compounding year on year for the last 5 years. So, at the time it seemed like a sensible place to go. My advice to anybody considering the Bay Area today is, maybe don't, or think about it really strategically, right? We have a little joke at Nitro, we call it ABBA, like where are we going to hire people next? Not the Swedish band, but anywhere but Bay Area. It is a nightmarish talent market. Average tenures in the Bay Area have come down to around 12 months for many roles. So engineering roles, technical roles in particular. Most VCs are telling us right now, we're sort of seeing it, we have probably much lower turnover than many other companies, but we see it as well. There are lots of bright, shiny objects in Silicon Valley and people jump ship very swiftly. So that the pressure for competition in the SF Bay Area market is just, it's out of control. When we moved there, San Francisco was not even the place to be. It was all happening in Silicon Valley, not in the city itself. That is completely inverted, and now 80 or 90% of all new engineering roles are being listed downtown rather than out in the suburbs. So look, the Valley is great, but I think you have to look at it very strategically now, given that it is so expensive. I'll just say that one more time. It is so expensive. It is absolutely insane. And the competition is fierce, right? Like, I'll give you a real, example of why it's hard without sort of mentioning names. We had a guy who worked for us who did a month with us, started in a key role, did a month with us, and then came to the leadership or his manager saying, I need to leave, I have to take this offer somewhere else, my wife has told me I have to do it. He was given 1.5 times his annual compensation as a signing bonus just to move. This is the guy, on a couple of $100,000 a year. So you get that kind of pressure in the Bay Area that you just don't get anywhere else. So I think to hire great people in the Bay Area is super expensive, super hard. If you don't have a brand, people aren't even interested. It's really tough for us. We're not that big. We don't have that big of a brand. So I think if you can build in Sydney or build in Melbourne or build in Dublin, as we are, you can be sort of strategic about San Francisco and kind of use it for business development, partnerships, and just it's a good place to have some sort of a presence. But I probably wouldn't make it your HQ unless you've got a really fat balance sheet or you just raised tens of millions of dollars. Dublin's really great as a location for those of you who are considering a place to expand in Europe. In my view, it's the best place to expand in Europe, bar none. The only other challenger really is London, but Dublin has a much better talent pool because it's been the place that foreign companies, technology companies, have invested for the past 30 years who are looking to get into Europe. You've got this incredibly rich pool, tens of thousands of highly qualified people. Like our entire team at Nitro Dublin, which we've scaled, we only opened the office 13 months ago, 14 months ago, and we've got about 40, 45 people there now. They're all ex-Google, ex-LinkedIn, ex-Facebook, ex-Salesforce. You can literally just walk in there and yank people out of the exactly comparable role at one of the Silicon Valley greats, and everyone's willing to leave and wants to leave because those companies are now employing 600 or 1,000 people in the Dublin locations. So I think what's happened with the Bay Area getting so expensive is that you have to look in a much more globally distributed way about how you staff your team.
Sure. I'll get to all the audience's questions as well. So let's go back to the early days. What worked and what didn't in terms of customer acquisition, and what were some of the early breakthrough moments of things that worked really, really well?
I think everything failed for us with the you know, we certainly tried everything, and I think what really worked was freemium. You know, we adopted freemium before freemium had a name, and actually it was either shareware it wasn't well perceived. I think by anyone except the people who were actually using you know, free software that was great. But what we found was that if you offer free software with genuine value, as in it's not adware, it's not malware, it's, you know, it's not a scam, people will not only want it, they will use it, and they will love it, and they'll talk about it. And so our most powerful marketing, this is back in the day of banner ads. We tried, you know, all sorts of corny kind of, you know, pay to play digital advertising. We tried print. We must have been drunk. I think we had to get drunk afterwards when we saw how much we'd spent with no return. You know, really freemium, just it was this thing that saved us actually in August of 2007. In fact, I was arguing with the board at the time who didn't want to pursue this strategy because they, you know, in some respects quite rightly said, well, why would, like, we just raised $1 million like to build stuff to sell it. Why do you want to give it away for free, you know? And at the time, we were in such dire straits that I think the board had no choice but to accept it as our last shot. And so we launched our freemium strategy. We actually did an unconventional kind of freemium strategy. We acquired a free product. We rebadged it as basically Buy Nitro. And it paid for itself. We only paid about 40,000 Aussie dollars for this little acquisition with the little money we had left. But the acquisition actually paid for itself in about 15 days in incremental revenue. And so we knew we were onto something. And so, you know, I think, you know, one key message for anybody who's wondering about attracting traffic, you know, how do you do SEM, do you do SEO? The thing about SEM is, you know, you pay to play, and it's a real cost. The thing about SEO is content is great, but free products and services are better. You know, good content has a long tail. You know, a lot of content doesn't. But services will absolutely out-page rank any content on the planet. And people will talk about them. People don't typically talk about content to the same extent that they talk about services. Like, I just found this great free tool for doing XYZ. And so that really was the aha moment for us. And we basically then acquired or launched a number of other free products and services, which, you know, built us up to basically a monthly free user base today in the many millions. And, you know, we've really acquired all of our 500,000 business customers through that freemium strategy as well. So if you're thinking that freemium only attracts SMB, don't. You know, it absolutely pulls you into the mid-market and the enterprise as well. Like the European Parliament, Continental AG, some of our biggest accounts all came through freemium. And we hadn't even met them. We did like multi-$100,000 deals with these customers and we'd never even met them.
Sure. What's your advice on taking on large competitors, or I guess you entered a market that was well developed versus creating a new market? Sort of, what's the unique attributes of competing with someone like Adobe?
Well, no one, customers don't love big brands, right? Customers don't love big companies typically. That's a bit different for, you know, the Nikes of this world and so on. But, you know, when it comes to software, you know, you talk to a CIO and ask him what he thinks of Adobe or Microsoft, and you know, it may or may not shock you, but they typically hate big vendors. So I think you have to focus on the fact that you are a small vendor, like be honest about it, You know, you don't want to look like you're two guys in a garage. That's you know, tough. But you don't want to look like Microsoft or Adobe either. We probably tried in the early days too hard to look big. Then we realized that customers actually chose us because we weren't big. So kind of play to that strength. Like we had a blog post the other day about our 500,000th customer. It was actually the Allied Irish Bank, one of Ireland's big four banks. They've got a big four as well, although not as successful. You know, we had a bit of a ceremony with them, did a photo shoot and stuff with them in Dublin. This is just a few weeks ago. And we actually had the CIO of AIB, so imagine sort of the CIO of Combank, you know, out in the freezing cold. It was like, you know, 2 degrees, literally, raining, and we're all out there in t-shirts and stuff and doing like star jumps, you know, jumping for joy for this photo shoot. And he actually did it, and I sort of couldn't believe it. And then he said to us that night, he said, that was the best few hours I've had with a vendor in 35 years, you know, of my career. And so, you know, I think you can play up to that. You can end up making your customers love you if you genuinely build a great product, sell to them, you know, as a startup that really loves them and wants to look after them, and that customer service angle can really help you win.
Is not being cloud native an inhibitor for future success? Or talk about these waves of technology, cloud obviously being one, and maybe mobile in the last year or two. Talk about how you react, and do you feel reacted too slowly, or how do you know to change the whole business?
Yeah, well, see, changing businesses is hard, right? Like, we're only a couple of hundred people, but it's extremely hard even for us to switch around to focus on Nitro Cloud. Like, if you imagine looking at a revenue line and imagine, and you know, you've got 150 or 200 people as you're starting to make this transition, and every month, you know, you're looking at the relativity of a brand new revenue line to the existing revenue line. It's very hard to convince people to take the new thing seriously internally. So I think it's a massive organizational design challenge as much as anything else. You know, for us with cloud, you know, Nitro Pro today is a business that's doing tens of millions in revenue, you know, and Nitro Cloud is kind of early single-digit millions. So it's, for us with cloud, I actually think we were too late. You know, we left it really late to make a run at this second chapter. But you sort of get trapped, I think, if you run your business basically on the P&L. You know, you're profitable. We've always been profitable. You know, you kind of pay your way, but what it does prevent you from doing is really looking too far out in front. So I was just saying to one of the guests here tonight, David, that you know, we at Nitro, I think the biggest thing that changed for me when we raised a bunch of money from Battery a few months ago was that I suddenly spent 80% of my time, you know, thinking about the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, whereas historically I'd spent 80% of my time worrying about hitting our monthly or quarterly number, which we're really good at. So for like in 6 years, we've never been more than 5% plus or minus of our annual revenue target, right? So we're a really amazing sales machine at Nitro, but we actually weren't a really amazing product machine. You know, we've had to make that transition. So I think cloud is everything today. I mean, the thing about cloud is we're in this very connected ecosystem world now that means that, you know, applications can be far more intelligent than they ever were before. And you can do an awful lot of stuff, very interesting stuff increasingly, you know, with big data in this world. And so I think, you know, the big trends for the next, I think cloud is kind of already an established trend. I don't think it's a trend as such. You know, I think mobile's in the same place. I think probably the biggest, you know, trend in the next 5 years will be artificial intelligence and applying big data, machine learning, you know, to these massive data sets that we all have. So, like, we just hired our first chief scientist a few months ago, started building a really serious data team, a bunch of data engineers, research scientists, that are all PhDs who are offensively smart. But, you know, we have a real amazing opportunity with Nitro Cloud, right? Like, we have more than 3 million documents a month transacting on Nitro Cloud today. So what we can do is, using natural language processing, actually inspect those documents and make observations about them. So without actually having to have a human look at a contract, we can say, hey, we know that's a purchase order. and we can make recommendations about content or your workflow to help you get documents signed faster or move through workflows faster or save you money or point out human error in the contract or whatever. So there's a bunch of really interesting stuff that you can do. I think AI is probably the single biggest trend that will drive this next generation of SaaS businesses and actually growth for existing SaaS businesses.
Sure. What was your darkest moment in the history of the company?
Oh, there's been a few of those. We've nearly lost the company twice. In August 2007, when we came within a few weeks of running out of cash, and freemium saved us. And then we had a boardroom coup kind of incident in 2010, and that was the very same. That brought us to within weeks of running out of money. The business had previously been profitable, and that would have been worse. If we'd blown it all up in the third year, and the business was only worth a little bit of money, you probably could have lived with that. If we'd blown it up in 2010 and we came within probably 2 weeks, of having it all go south, when the company was worth tens of millions, that would have been pretty embarrassing. So that was probably the darkest hour for most of us. I think we felt extraordinarily grateful to have the company that we had when we got control of the company again. That was probably the toughest time, I'd say, sort of early to mid 2010.
Sure. Are you offering private self-hosted cloud to large enterprises to overcome the IT policies behind the firewall?
That's a really good question. No, we're not right now. We tend to believe in the public cloud. We think it will win in the long run. Philosophically, that's our belief. So we don't do it today. We may do it in the future. I actually think when you start having conversations with CIOs, though, today, you get less resistance on this topic than you might think. At least that's our experience. I think several years ago, CIOs got fired for cloud. I think now CIOs get fired for deploying shitty software that nobody uses. So, I really think the private cloud options work in certain scenarios, but I'm definitely a pro public cloud advocate.
Sure. One more question remaining. What are the advantages and disadvantages of being based in Australia?
Well, it's cheaper than San Francisco now, although it's still pretty freaking expensive. Like Dublin by comparison is probably 20 or 30% cheaper on average for most roles. I think Australia's got a great economy going for it. I think we've got a lot of inherent momentum and strength, and I think the ecosystem here, the startup ecosystem here, is really impressive. So if you're building a business in Australia today, I would say keep building it in Australia and look at how you leverage places like San Francisco, places like Dublin. I think that the world's becoming more diversified, even as more technology power concentrates in the Bay Area. I think from a staffing strategy point of view, you have to be looking globally. Even in the States, we're looking at other options like Austin or Boston or Seattle, or across the border to Canada, to Toronto or Vancouver, to diversify. So I think in Australia, you can take the same approach. I think Sydney and Melbourne seem to be pretty much on the same level in terms of kind of the scale of the ecosystem. I'm not really sure where the other cities sit, but I assume they're a little bit behind. But I think this is a great place to build a business, particularly in the early days when you're looking to do it a bit more cost effectively and do it with a support network that's credible. And now that there are so many businesses spinning off, whether it's out of Atlassian or the work that the guys at Blackbird are doing, there are lots of people to ask how, and that was completely missing when we started. Like when I moved to the States, there was no ecosystem in Australia. Like in Melbourne, I don't even think the word meetup had entered the lexicon, in 2008.
Cool. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks. Please thank Sam.
Thank you, Niki. Thank you, guys.